Carleton County. I'm going to cover the invasion of France. So this would be the fall of France. It's the next topic I'm going to cover here tonight. The next part of the World War II timeline. So this here, fall rot, case red, is the invasion of France, which started from June 5th to the June 25th. So roughly 3 weeks in France fell. Now, of course, this much of the French military machine was caught in Belgium and cut off, and of course the trap door, which pushed the British through to Dunkirk, pushed them back to Dunkirk, where they had to seek rescue from their own ships and even civilian vessels to come across back to England. Now, much of France is alone. Now, much of the British have left, and of course, some more are going to be fighting into France until Operation Ariel, and another operation is going to take them out and get them back to England. But much of the French military, they're out of reserves. They're out of their best tanks. Over 60 divisions have been lost. The best tanks, their best artillery, their best men have been caught and surrounded in Blitzkrieg operations. And certainly, like you can see here, here's some of the fall rot operations on screen. So now, what's going to happen is Gamelin and a number of other commanders are going to have to make tough decisions and either pushing back against the Germans futilely, which is futile. But then, of course, as you can see here, the top French commanders have very difficult decisions to make, and eventually France falls to Germany in a matter of weeks. Coming through the Ardennes, of course, they push past the Maginot Line, and the Maginot Line eventually will be taken just as well, step by step, using modern German artillery, some of their best German artillery, some of it even being World War I as well, what's left, but also some of their newest guns as well, 150 millimeters, 88 millimeter guns. So, all right. So, here's the French flag. So here is Hitler after the fall of Paris and the Armistice is signed. This is him. There's a famous photo of him and some of his top people. This is right in Paris, of course, in front of the Eiffel Tower. Famous photo. So Germany had mobilized 4,200,000 men of the Heer, German army, 1 million of the Luftwaffe, German Air Force, 180,000 of the Kriegsmarine, German Navy, and 100,000 of the Waffen SS, military arm of the Nazi Party. When consideration is made for those in Poland, Denmark, and Norway, the army had 3 million men available for the offensive on the 10th of May, 1940, which, as I mentioned before in the other stages, France is the main target. So May 10th, they begin the invasion of Luxembourg, Holland, and Belgium, and they do not last long, of course. And the push through the Sedan, the Battle of Sedan, and Arras, and the Battle of Hanut, which is the first major tank battle of the war. And now, coming through the Ardennes and into France, even after Dunkirk, with thousands of Germans that were killed, many more Allies that were killed and captured, the situation is more dire, certainly for the Allies. Hold on. So, the Army had 3 million men available for the offensives on May 10th, 1940, for Case Yellow and Case Red. These manpower reserves were formed into 157 divisions. Of these, 135 were earmarked for the offensive, including 42 reserve divisions. The German forces in the West in May and June deployed some 2,439 tanks and 7,378 guns. So these are the divisions that were fully used, certainly for France, for Belgium and Holland and Luxembourg. So 7,378 guns, 2,445 tanks, 5,638 aircraft in the Luftwaffe, 3.350 million troops, 3,350,000 troops. Italians in the Alps with 22 divisions, 3,000 guns, and 300,000 Italians. And this is June 10th, I believe, is when Mussolini enters the war, and he needs an excuse to at least do something, which was invade southern France and take some of the colonial areas. Um, so the Allies, 135 divisions, 13,974 guns, 3,383 to 4,071 French tanks, M35, Char B, and other ones as well. And so 2,935 aircraft, 3.3 million troops, and the French in the Alps with 5 divisions and 150,000 men. So with Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, the numbers killed in Belgium, 10,232 officers and soldiers, missing 8,463 officers and soldiers, wounded 42,523 officers and soldiers. Losses of the Luftwaffe from 10th of May to June 3rd, 432 aircraft. Now, this is also, so that's including pretty much this as well as on Dunkirk as well, which is in France. No losses to the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine. Killed in the Netherlands, 2,032, 7,000 wounded, 4 armored trains destroyed, and 225 to 275 aircraft destroyed, and 1,350 captured, sent to England. In Dunkirk, the losses were the heaviest for them so far. 20,000 killed and wounded, loss of 100 tanks, 240 aircraft in theater, and 156 aircraft on the Dunkirk front. And that's so from the end of May, May 24th to 27th, 30 to 31st, when the British are retreating. The British are retreating further to Dunkirk, and the evacuation has already started. And so the French are helping what's left of the French forces in the area, but the British are pushing back hard and holding the line, at least trying to, until 340,000 soldiers. Belgium, certainly over 200,000 British, and 140,000 French and Belgian soldiers as well. So, the Supreme Commander of all German operations, Walter Heinrich Alfred Hermann von Brauchitsch, 4th of October 1881, 18th of October 1948, was a German field marshal and the commander-in-chief of the German army during World War II. Born into an aristocratic military family, Brauchitsch entered army service in 1901. During World War I, he served with distinction in the Corps and division-level staff on the Western Front. After the Nazi seizure of power in 1933, Brauchitsch was put in charge of the East Prussian military district. He borrowed immense sums of money from Hitler and became dependent on his financial help. Brauchitsch serves as commander-in-chief of the German army from February 1938 until December 1941. He played a key role in the Battle of France, and oversaw the German invasions of Yugoslavia and Greece later on. For his part in the Battle of France, he became one of 12 generals promoted to Field Marshal. And the other commanders, which I've talked to before in other presentations, Gerd von Rundstedt, Peter von Bock, William von Lieb, Albert Kesselring, Hugo Speer, which is from a commander, the Italian commander that was in charge of the Italian troops from Italy in Lower France. So, Albert Joseph Georges, one of the top French commanders opposing the plan by Supreme Commander Maurice Gamelin to move the best Allied forces into the Low Countries, he was overruled. Georges tried to allow as much initiative to his subordinates as possible to improve operational flexibility. Georges was appointed as Gamelin's deputy, but they had a mutually hostile relationship. On the outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939, Georges became commander of all French field armies. Gamelin and Georges assured Delaunay, another commander, that France had the greatest army in the world and were shocked when the Allied front was broken through at the Sedan by the Wehrmacht. According to the memoirs of Captain André Beaufort, after the front was broken, the feeling was rife in George's headquarters staff that the battle with the Germans was lost. Beaufort himself witnessed George breaking into tears. On the 19th of May 1940, Gamelin and Georges were both dismissed. General Weygand returned as head of the French army, and I believe it was from up in Syria or Libya and down in those colonial areas. Weygand, Maxime Weygand, mainly served as a staff officer to Ferdinand Foch in World War I. Weygand initially fought against the Germans during the invasion of France in 1940, but then signed an armistice with and partially collaborated with the Germans as part of the Vichi France regime before being arrested by the Germans for not fully collaborating with them. By late May 1940, the military disaster in France after the German invasion was such that the supreme commander and political neutral, Maurice Gamelin, was dismissed, and Weygand, a figurehead of the right, recalled from Syria to replace him. Paul Reynald, French Prime Minister, born 15th of October 1878, dies 21st September 1966. The French politician and lawyer, prominent in the interwar period, noted for his stances on economic liberalism and militant opposition to Germany. In World War II, Reynald became Prime Minister on March 21st, 1940. He made Charles de Gaulle, Under Secretary of State for War, and as France was collapsing under the German onslaught that in May, he urged French resistance and maintenance of the alliance with Britain. But Marshal Philippe Pétain, a World War I hero, another commander of the French military, whom Reynald had made vice premier, Pétain actually, vice premier, not commander, to strengthen his cabinet and other ministries, preferred armistice with Germany. Unwilling to be party to an armistice, Reynald resigned on June 16th. Arrested shortly thereafter, he was kept in captivity for the duration of the war. The Battle of France is the name of the World War II battle between the Allied powers and Germany in and around France, of course. This battle took place from May 10th to the 25th of June, and certainly after the end of the period of waiting at the Phony War following the German invasion of Poland in 1939. The Battle of France is remembered today. So that was the end. This happened May 10th. Fall Gale and Fall Rot happens after the Phony Wars in Poland, and of course the invasion of Weserunbund, Denmark and Norway, and so Germany unleashed Blitzkrieg Tactics during the Battle of France to absolute great success. This tactic saw German forces move at an incredible pace and overwhelm the Allied forces wherever they met. The battle began with German forces invading France through the Ardennes forest near southern Belgium. France had spent the years after World War I preparing a line of defenses along its border that it shared with Germany. The defenses was called the Maginot Line and ran from the Switzerland Alps in the south to the Ardennes forest. However, it did not extend north to the British Channel. France believed that the Ardennes forest was too thick for German tanks and forces to move through, and did not extend the Maginot Line any further north. As well, they believed that any German attack would come directly across the border to France, and that the heavily defended Maginot Line would be enough to withstand the attack. This false sense of security by France would have a profound impact on the outcome of the battle. So here we have, of course, what France will be divided into after. This is occupied France. So this is occupied France, and this will become Vichy France, Free France first, and then Vichy France afterward. And the German living space, the Germans take this area here, swath for German Lebensraum, living space. Annexations here in these small areas. German occupation zone, of course, is all of this. And of course, area intended for German settlement is in the striped orange. So the free zone until November 11th, 1942, and this is here, what will become Vichy France. Coastal military zone is the Atlantic Wall along here, Brest, Cherbourg, in those areas. And then the Italian occupation zone from Mussolini from June 10th onward, it pushes in, and Italian's occupation zone is here, these patches here. And then from 1942 onward to September 1943, they push in Corsica, and then up Toulon, and up to almost like near to Geneva. And that's that green striped area. Of course, the Allied countries, England and Belgium and Holland, which were taken. England, of course, after the Battle of France, stands on its own. And that's the first time that German forces have directly been stopped, dead cold. And that's the English Channel. The French, the air bases along the French coast were definitely used during the Battle of Britain to try to suppress British air forces. Heavy bomber bases, the Luftwaffe bombing units from DO-17s to HE-111s, Ju-88s, they all launched from either from Belgium and from the coastal France area. And that's, of course, also where they hit London. Neutral countries, Switzerland, and of course, only one you can see there is Switzerland, but then, of course, there's Sweden up. But, of course, Sweden was secretly selling arms and supplies to Germany, and in Switzerland done something similar, during money in Swiss banks. I'm not. Have to do some more research on that though. Okay. So the German attack through the Ardennes force, codenamed Case Yell, caught Belgium and Britain and France by surprise. The German forces were able to easily push their way through the Ardennes forest and moved as a surprisingly fast pace. By pushing through the region, Germany planned on dividing the Allied forces and circling around the Allied soldiers in order to trap them and cut them off from Allied support. And that's, in a sense, what they did with the French, and they cut off the British and pushed them back into to the sea at Dunkirk. The French forces then defended against the German attack at Ardennes, were poorly equipped and unable to stop the German advance. As such, the German tank divisions pushed through and forced the French and British forces into the north to retreat toward the British Channel. Famously, the British Expeditionary Force and some French forces were forced to group in Dunkirk and await an opportunity to evacuate to England. During the end of May and early June 1940, 200,000 British forces and 140,000 French and Belgian forces were transported back across the English Channel to avoid the full German attack. This retreat at Dunkirk would come to be an important event in World War II, as many of these same Allied forces would play an important role in later battles of World War II, including the invasion of Normandy. After the Allied retreat at Dunkirk, the remainder of France was left to undergo the full German Blitzkrieg attack. Italy joined the fighting on June 10th, as I mentioned, when it entered the war on the side of Germany, and by June 14th, Paris was under the control of German troops, by German troops. The Battle of France was over, and Britain stood alone as the last Allied country in Europe to stand against the aggression of Germany. At the end of the Battle of France, Nazi Germany took over direct control of the northern half of France and created a puppet state in the south called Vichi France. And I mentioned some of this. This is just an overview. Germany would use the northern parts of France to help carry out its bombing runs during the Battle of Britain. In total, the Allies suffered over 360,000 casualties in the battle, while the Axis suffered 163. So this here is the QF 25 pounder, quick firing 25 pounder Mark II. This howitzer is it's a or more pointedly 25 pounder 25 PDR. It's a major howitzer of the British military during the Second World War. I mean, the shell weight is 25 pounds. HE, that's high explosive, including the fuse of it. The shell is actually 88 millimeter times 292 millimeter, high explosive any tank, either smoke or high explosive squash head rounds. The maximum firing range is 13,400 yards with an HE shell. It's crewed by 6 men, and as you can see here, this is one of the main howitzers used by the British military, and this is during the invasion of France and Belgium. So this design, this here is a short, it's a shorter barrel. The design, the QF-25 we even have them here in Canada. The one that was restored, I believe it was in St. John, a 25 pounder, and they're once they are restored, they're beautifully displayed, and then we have a few of them in Canada, along with QF 6 pounders and a number of other ones across Canada. So German forces began fall rot, case read on the 5th of June. 60 remaining French divisions and the two British divisions in France that were left after Dunkirk made a determined stand on the Somme and Aisne, but were defeated by the German combination of air superiority and armored mobility. German tanks outflanked the Maginot Line and pushed deep into France, occupying Paris unopposed on the 14th of June. After the flight of the French government and the collapse of the French army, German commanders met with French officials on the 18th of June to negotiate an end of hostilities. On the 22nd of June, the second armistice at Compiègne, was signed by France and Germany. The neutral Vichy government, led by Marshal Philippe Pétain, superseded the Third Republic, and Germany occupied the North Sea and Atlantic coasts of France and their hinterlands. The Italian invasion of France over the Alps took a small amount of ground, and after the armistice, Italy occupied a small occupation zone in the southeast. The Vichy regime retained the unoccupied territory in the south called Zone Libre. In November 1942, the Germans and Italians occupied the zone under Case Anton, Fall Anton, until the Allied liberation in 1944. So here we have troops of an SS Panzer Division, Totenkopf, examined. It's a British Expeditionary Force medium tank, Matilda II. It was knocked out during the Battle of Arras. So it's one of their tanks that were knocked out. Good picture. So during the 1930s, the French built the Maginot Line, fortifications along the border with Germany. The line was intended to economize on manpower and to have deterrence against a German invasion across the Franco-German border by diverting it into Belgium, which could then be met by the best divisions of the French army. The war would take place outside French territory, avoiding the destruction of the First World War, which had happened in 1914. The main section of the Maginot Line ran from the Swiss border and ended at Longueuil. The hills and woods of the Ardennes region were thought to cover the area to the north. General Philippe Pétain, not politician, sorry, declared the Ardennes to be impenetrable as long as special provisions were taken to destroy an invasion force, as it emerged from the Ardennes by a pincer attack. The French commander-in-chief, Maurice Gamelin, also believed the area to be safe from attack, noting it never favored large operations. French war games held in 1938 of a hypothetical German armored attack through the Ardennes left the army with the impression that the region was still largely impenetrable, and that this, along with the obstacle of the Maas River, would allow the French time to bring up troops into the area to counter an attack. So here's more of the Maginot Line. You see the inward tunnels and the impressive infrastructure from the 30s that took and the resources it took to build this. And it was unfortunate that it never got the full force of it was able to be used. Heavy guns, heavy reinforced concrete bunkers, tunnels, amazing. So here we have just more of course, the Ardennes forest and through Sedan and up through and closing the door, the trap door to the British, and pushing them to Dunkirk, and then of course the invasion of Luxembourg and directly into France, and of course up north the Netherlands, Belgium, and then Luxembourg, France. So Luxembourg here, and then of course, and eventually. And of course, soon after the Germans would invade directly from below the Maginot Line and take more the Maginot Line, including Metz, step by step, as the push toward Paris was being done as well. So by the end of May 1940, the best and most modern French armies had been sent north and lost. In the resulting encirclement, the French had also lost much of their heavy weaponry and their best armored formations. Overall, the Allies had lost 61 divisions in fall gale. Weygand was faced with the prospect of defending a long front stretched from Sedan to the Channel. With a greatly depleted French army now lacking significant Allied support, Weygand had only 64 French divisions and the 51st Highland Infantry Division, the British infantry division, available. Weygand lacked the reserves to counter a breakthrough or to replace frontline troops should they become exhausted from a prolonged battle on a front of 965 kilometers, 600 miles. The Germans had 142 divisions to use, and air supremacy except over the English Channel would certainly help them take down much of the push back against the French army. The French also had to deal with millions of civilian refugees fleeing the war as they're trying to advance in what became known as l'Exode, the Exodus. Automobiles and horse-drawn carts carrying possessions clogged roads, as the government had not foreseen such a rapid military collapse. There were few plans to cope. Between 6 and 10 million French fled, sometimes so quickly that they left uneaten meals on tables, while even officials stated that there was no need to panic and that civilians should stay. The population of Chartres declined from 23,000 to 800, and Lille from 200,000 to 20,000, while cities in the south, such as Pau and Bordeaux, rapidly grew in size. While Italy declared war on France and Britain on the 10th of June, it was not prepared for war and made little impact during the last 2 weeks of fighting in the Italian invasion of France. Italian dictator Benito Mussolini was aware of this and sought to profit from German successes. Mussolini felt the conflict would soon end, and he reportedly said to the army chief of staff, Marshal Badoglio, I only need a few thousand dead so that I can sit at the peace conference as a man who has fought. The army of the Alps, General Reynald Orleri was defeated by the Italian army. Here's a painting of course, some German soldiers holding up an armored crew of an Samoa S-35 French cavalry tank. Of course, these guys are surrendering, and the Germans are, of course, capturing them. This is one of the tanks that built from 1936 until 1940 to equip the armored divisions of the cavalry. It was for its time a relatively agile medium tank, superior in armor and armament to its French and foreign competitors, such as the contemporary version of the German Panzer III. So this is one of the tanks that's seen in the picture. This is the tank seen in the picture here. And then here's some German officers in Paris. There's some photographs, photographs of paintings. The Germans began their second offensive on the 5th of June on the Somme and the Aisne. During the next 3 weeks, far from the easy advance of the Wehrmacht expected, they encountered strong resistance from a rejuvenated French army. The French armies had fallen back on their lines of supply and communications and were closer to repair shops, supply dumps, and stores. About 112,000 French soldiers from Dunkirk were repatriated via the Normandy and Brittany ports, a partial substitute for the lost divisions in Flanders. The French were also able to make a good significant amount of their armored losses, and so they were able to make up from that on numbers of those armored losses and raise the 1st and 2nd DCR heavy armored divisions, and the 4th DCR also had its losses replaced. Morale rose and was very high by the end of May 1940. Most French soldiers that joined the line only knew of German success by hearsay. So here we have soldiers with the rifle is holding on the soldier on the right is the MAS 36 rifle. It's 7.5 millimeter French Army rifle. And then of course they also had the submachine gun, the MAS 38. The 7.5 millimeter, it's a 5-round internal clip or internal magazine. It's loaded by a 5-round clip. It's very similar in its same category as the Kar 98, Mosin Nagant Russian rifle, the British Lee Enfield. So French officers had gained tactical experience against German mobile units and had more confidence in their weapons after seeing that their artillery and tanks performed better than German armor. The French tanks were now known to have better armor and armament, Samoa and of course the Char B. And between the 23rd and 28th of May, the French 7th and 10th armies were reconstituted. Weygand decided to implement defense in depth and use delaying tactics to inflict maximum attrition on the German units. Small towns and villages were fortified for all-round defense as tactical hedgehogs. Behind the front line, the new infantry, armored, and half-mechanized divisions formed up, ready to counter-attack and relieve the surrounding units, which were to hold out at all costs. The 47 divisions of Army Group B attacked either side of Paris, with the majority of the mobile units after 48 hours. The German offensive had not broken through. On the Aisne, the 16th Panzer Corps employed over 1,000 AFVs in 2 panzer divisions and a motorized division against the French. The German offensive tactics were crude, and Hoppner soon lost 80 out of 500 AFVs, armored fighting vehicles, in the first attack. So they were deploying them. They knew where they were going to win, so they deployed them haphazardly. German offensive tactics were crude, and as I mentioned, the Fourth Army captured bridgeheads over the Somme, but the Germans struggled to get over the Aisne. At Amiens, the Germans were repeatedly driven back by French artillery fire and really realized that French tactics were much improved. The German army relied on the Luftwaffe to silence French artillery and enabled German infantry to inch forward. German progress was made only late on the third day of operations, finally forcing crossings. The French Air Force, Armée de l'Air, attempted to bomb them but failed. German sources acknowledged the battle was hard and costly in lives, the enemy putting up severe resistance, particularly in the woods, and tree lines continuing the fight when our troops had pushed past the point of resistance. And that's what the certainly very tough situation. Soon, south of Abbeville, the French 10th Army, General Robert Altmeyer, was forced to retreat to Rouen and then south over the Seine River. The 7th Panzer Division forced the surrender of the British 51st Highland Division on the 12th of June 1940 and then crossed the Seine River to race through Normandy, capturing the port of Cherbourg on 18th of June. German spearheads were overextended and vulnerable to counterattack, but the Luftwaffe denied the French the ability to concentrate, and the fear of air attack negated their mass and mobility. So they were more and more dependent on the Luftwaffe and Stuka dive bombers to take out and Messerschmitt Me-109s, FW-190s, to help push French forces back. On the 10th of June, the French government declared Paris an open city. The German 18th Army now deployed against Paris. The French resisted the approaches to the capital strongly, but the line was broken in several places. Weygand asserted it would not take long for the French army to disintegrate. On the 13th of June, Churchill attended a meeting of the Anglo-French Supreme War Council at Tours and suggested a Franco-British Union, but this was refused. On the 14th of June, Paris fell. Parisans who stayed in the city found that in most cases the Germans were extremely well mannered. And this is a French motorcycle unit here in this picture. The situation in the air also had worsened. Luftwaffe air superiority had become air supremacy as the Armée de l'Air came to the verge of collapse. The French had only just begun to make the majority of bomber sorties. Between the 5th and 9th of June, during Operation Paula, over 1,815 sorties, 518 by bombers, were flown. The number of sorties declined as losses were now becoming impossible to replace. The RAF attempted to divert the attention of the Luftwaffe, with 660 sorties flown against targets over the Dunkirk area, but suffered many losses. On the 21st of June, 37 Bristol Blenheims were destroyed. After June 9th, French aerial resistance virtually ceased. Some surviving aircraft withdrew to French North Africa. The Luftwaffe now ran riot. Its attacks focused on the direct and indirect support of the German army. So direct ground support. The Luftwaffe attacked lines of resistance, which then quickly collapsed under armored attack. Meanwhile, to the east, Army Group C was to help Army Group A encircle and capture the French forces on the Maginot Line. The goal of the operation was to envelop the Metz region with its fortifications to prevent a French counteroffensive from the Alsace region against the German line on the Somme. Guderian's 19th Corps was to advance to the French border with Switzerland and trap the French forces on the Vosges Mountains. Vosges Mountains, while the 16th Corps attacked the Maginot Line from the west into its vulnerable rear to take the cities of Verdun, Toul, and Metz. The French, meanwhile, had moved the French Second Army Group from the Alsace and Lorraine to the Wagram line on the Somme, leaving only small forces guarding the Maginot Line. After Army Group B had begun its offensive against Paris and into Normandy, Army Group A began its advance into the rear of the Maginot Line. On the 15th of June, Army Group C launched Operation Tiger, a frontal assault across the Rhine and into France. And that's what you saw directly from France going in on June 15th, the lower arrow in that map. German attempts to break open or into the Maginot Line prior to Operation Tiger had failed. One assault lasted for 8 hours on the extreme north of the line, costing the Germans 46 dead and 251 wounded, while just 2 French were killed, one at Fernchappy and one at Fremont Fortress. On the 15th of June, the last well-equipped French forces, including the French Fourth Army, were preparing to leave as the Germans struck. The French now holding the line were skeletal. The Germans directly outnumbered the French greatly. They could call upon the First Army Corps of 7 divisions and 1,000 artillery pieces, although most were First World War vintage and could not penetrate the thick armor of the fortresses. Only 88mm 3.5-inch guns could do the job, and 16 were allocated to the operation. To bolster this, 150mm 5.9-inch guns and 8 railway batteries were also employed. The Luftwaffe deployed the Flieger Corps 5 to give air support. You can see here where the shells are penetrating. Here's the Maginot Line map. The battle was difficult and slow progress was made against strong French resistance. However, each fortress was overcome one by one. One fortress, Schronenberg, fired 15,802 75mm shells, 3-inch guns, rounds at attacking German infantry. It was the most heavily shelled of all the French positions. Nevertheless, its armor protected it from fatal damage. The same day Operation Tiger was launched, Operation Kleiner Bar began. 5 assault divisions of the 7th Army Corps crossed the Rhine into the Colmar area with a view to advancing the Vosges Mountains. It had 400 artillery pieces bolstered by heavy artillery and mortars. They drove the French 104th Division and 105th Division back into the Vosges Mountains on 17th of June. However, on the same day, Guderian's 19th Corps reached the Swiss border, and the Maginot Line, the Maginot defenses, were cut off from the rest of France. Most units surrendered on the 25th of June, and the Germans claimed to have taken 500,000 prisoners. Some main fortresses continued to fight, despite appeals for surrender. The last only capitulated on the 10th of July, after a request from Georges, and only then under protest. Of the 58 main fortifications on the Maginot Line, 10 were captured by the Wehrmacht in battle. So here we have more from Volgelb and Vollrot. And this is Vollrot, case red, pushing through Cherbourg, and then of course units coming down, swooping down into the side, going to Lyons, and then of course Guderian's going to take the Maginot Line from the rear and going back across the Maas River, and taking those positions. The evacuation of the 2nd British Expeditionary Force took place during Operation Ariel between the 15th and 25th of June. The Luftwaffe, with complete domination of the French skies, was determined to prevent more Allied evacuations after the Dunkirk debacle. Flag Corps 1 was assigned to the Normandy and Brittany sectors. On the 9th and 10th of June, the port of Cherbourg was subject to 15 tons of German bombs, while Le Havre received 10 bombing attacks that sank 2,949 GRT of escaping Allied shipping. On 17th of June, Junkers Ju-88s, mainly from Kampfschwager 30, sank a 10,000-ton ship. The 16,243 GRT liner RMS Lacastria off of St. Nazaire, killing some 4,000 Allied personnel, nearly doubling the British killed in the Battle of France. Yet the Luftwaffe failed to prevent the evacuation of some 190,000 to 200,000 Allied personnel. So Operation Ariel and Operation Cycle, the forgotten evacuations of June 1940. Some of these two were actually, some people call them Dunkirk 2, because it was another major ship-borne evacuation, and not without cost. Operation Cycle on the 10th and 13th of June 1940 was immediately put into action. So that was after Operation Ariel. British forces cut off from escape at Dunkirk, terribly disorganized and ill-equipped, fled westwards along the coast, making for Le Havre. The 51st Highland Division, assisted by General de Gaulle's tanks, fought a bloody rearguard against Rommel's 7th Panzer Division. While the port of Le Havre suddenly cut off, the Allies fled to St. Valery in Caux, where Operation Cycle was ready to embark them. There would be no flotilla of little boats this time. Under air cover from the RAF, the troops were transferred at the port onto destroyers and civilian ships, commandeered for the purpose, and ferried off the beaches. The 10th and 11th of June, 2,137 British and 1,184 French were rescued from St. Valery before the 51st Highland Division finally surrendered. The men who had managed to reach Le Havre fared better. From the 10th and 13th June, over 11,000 British troops were rescued, and the relentless Germans pushed onward, rolling British and French troops further westward. So more about Operation Ariel. Despite the lessons learned at Dunkirk, Operation Cycle had shown that large-scale troop embarkation onto larger ships could be accomplished. On the 15th of June, a flotilla of Royal Navy and Merchant Marine ships converged on the ports of western France. The ships were supported from the southern French bases by 5 Royal Air Force RAF fighter squadrons, which were further assisted by squadrons from England. The task was to enter the major seaports of St. Nazaire and Nantes and rescue British, Polish, and Czech troops who had been directed there. Under Luftwaffe attack, the ships loaded troops and equipment, but disorganization made figures inaccurate. On the 17th of June, the Luftwaffe sank the Canard liner Lacastria, which I mentioned, in the Loire estuary. The troopship had just embarked thousands of troops, RAF personnel, and civilians. It was estimated that at least 3,500 died in the sinking. To conform to the terms of the Armistice on June 22nd, the evacuation of Operation Ariel officially ended on the 25th of June. Over 191,000 troops were rescued in Operation Ariel, mainly British, Polish, and Czech personnel, although accurate figures of nationalities are still not known. In all, Operation Ariel and Cycle rescued over 200,000 troops, including RAF ground crew, ancillary staff, and tons of equipment. Not quite the dramatic rescue of Dunkirk's flotilla of little boats, but Not a drop in the bucket either. Considering the amount of men deployed and the amount of men rescued, British deaths in the Battle of France were only 10,000, and that figure includes 3,500 from the HMT, or the HMS Lancastria. So here we have Lower Saint Nazaire, Lorient, and these are major Brest. Those soon after France has capitulated, those become major U-boat bases for concrete U-boat pens that will continue to launch against convoys in the North Atlantic. And last night I just finished watching. I watched Greyhound. Awesome movie. Very good. Very good. Very well done. Very impressed. Um, yeah. Still, there's a few things I wonder about accuracy, but it seems pretty good. As far as a Fletcher-class destroyer, the Americans launching attacks to try to stop German U-boats from attacking their convoy. That was an everyday thing in the Battle of the Atlantic. Armistice. With Paris fallen and the German conquest of France reaching its conclusion, Marshal Henri Pétain replaces Paul Reynald as Prime Minister and announces his intention to sign an armistice with the Nazis. The next day, French General Charles de Gaulle, not very well known even to the French, made a broadcast to France from England, urging his countrymen to continue the fight against Germany. A military hero during World War I, Pétain was appointed Vice Premier of France in May 1940 to boost morale in a country crumbling under the force of the Nazi invasion. Instead, Pétain arranged an armistice with the Nazis. The armistice, signed by the French on June 22nd, went into effect on the 25th of June. And more than half of France was occupied by the Germans. In July, Pétain took office as Chief of State at Vichy, a city in unoccupied France. The Vichy government under Pétain collaborated with the Nazis, and French citizens suffered on both sides of the divided nation. In 1942, Pierre Laval, an opportunistic French fascist and dutiful Nazi collaborator, won the trust of Nazi leader Adolf Hitler, and the elderly Pétain became merely a figurehead in the Vichy regime. Discouraged by his cabinet's hostile reaction to a British proposal for a Franco-British Union to avoid defeat, and believing that his ministers no longer supported him, Reynald resigned on the 16th of June. He was succeeded by Pétain, who delivered a radio address to the French people announcing his intention to ask for an armistice with Germany. When Hitler received word from the French government that they wished to negotiate an armistice, he selected the forest of Compiègne as the site for the negotiations. Compiègne had been the site of the 1918 armistice, which ended the First World War with a humiliating defeat of Germany. Hitler viewed the choice of location as a supreme moment of revenge for Germany over France. On the 21st of June 1940, Hitler visited the site to start the negotiations, which took place in the same railway carriage in which the 1918 armistice was signed. It had just been removed from a museum building and placed on the spot where it was located in 1918. Hitler sat in the same chair in which Marshal Ferdinand Foch sat when he faced the defeated German representatives. After listening to the reading of the preamble, Hitler left the carriage in a calculated gesture of disdain for the French delegates, and negotiations were turned over to William Keitel, the chief of staff of the OKW, so the Wehrmacht. The armistice was signed on the next day, on the 18th, at 1836 hours French time, by General Keitel for Germany and Hunziker for France. The armistice and ceasefire went into effect 2 days and 6 hours later, at 00:35 on 25th of June. Once the Franco-Italian Armistice had also been signed at 1835 on the 24th of June near Rome. So here's the car, and here is the Führer and his top commanders, including Cato. Here is the Armistice being signed. Cato. In year 2000, Ernest May wrote that Hitler had better insight into the French and British governments than vice versa, and knew that they would not go to war over Austria and Czechoslovakia because he concentrated on politics rather than the state and national interest. From 1937 to 1940, Hitler stated his views on events, their importance, and his intentions, then defended them against a contrary opinion from the likes of former Chiefs of the General Staff Ludwig Beck and Ernst von Weizsäcker. Hitler sometimes concealed aspects of his thinking, but he was unusually frank about priority and his assumptions. Here's the Führer, some of his top commanders. France was divided into a German occupation zone in the north and west, and a free zone, Zone Libre, in the south, as I mentioned. Both zones were nominally under the sovereignty of the French rump state headed by Pétain that replaced the French Third Republic. This rump state is often referred to as Vichi France. In response to the formation of a new political structure in France mandated by the Nazi government of Germany, Charles de Gaulle, who had been made an Undersecretary of National Defense by Reynald in London at the time of the Armistice, delivered his appeal of 18th June. With this speech, de Gaulle refused to recognize Petain's Vichy government as legitimate and began the task of organizing the Free French forces. The British doubted Admiral François Darlin's promise not to allow the French fleet at Toulon to fall into German hands by the wording of the armistice conditions. They feared the Germans would seize the French Navy's fleet, docked at ports in Vichy France and North Africa, and use them in an invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion. Within a month, the Royal Navy attacked the French naval forces stationed in North Africa. In the attack on Mers-l'Île-Colbert, the British Chiefs of Staff Committee had concluded in May 1940 that if France collapsed, we do not think we could continue the war with any chance of success. Without full economic, and we do not think that we could continue the war with any chance of success without full economic and financial support from the United States. Churchill's desire for American aid led to, in September, to the destroyers for bases agreement that began the wartime Anglo-American partnership and the Lend-Lease agreement. So about a quarter of all arms produced by the United States, a quarter of them would go to England for the war effort, and America was still going to be neutral for another year. But the Lend-Lease agreement is such. The occupation of the various French zones continued until November 1942, when the Allies began Operation Torch, the invasion of western North Africa. To safeguard southern France, the Germans enacted Case Anton and occupied Vichy France. In June 1944, the Western Allies launched Operation Overlord, followed by the Operation Dragoon on the French Mediterranean coast on 15th of August. This threatened to cut off the German troops in western and central France, and most began to retire toward Germany. The fortified French Atlantic U-boat bases remained as pockets until the German capitulation. On the 24th of August 1944, Paris was liberated, and by September 1944, most of the country was in Allied hands. That's years away. So here we have the occupied zone and the German occupation zone from November 1942, the northern zone. So, and this here is the closed zone. You see on the right, zone of German settlement, territories annexed by the Reich, the Third Reich. The militarized zone, 50 kilometers in the sector here. Grenoble, and of course here's the Italian zone. Italian occupation, November 42, September 1943, and that's the Italian occupation zone after Vichi France is taken over. And the free zone from 1942, so this will be this zone was taken over in about that time, and so to prevent the Allies from taking southern France. And Luxembourg was that's interesting. Luxembourg was annexed to the Reich in 1942, and so you can see, and up here too is the this zone here from Dunkirk, near Dunkirk here, but Belgium and areas that are taken, and these are areas that are annexed by the German Reich. Military administration of Belgium and northern France is here in that sector. So the return of refugees in this area is prohibited. This zone is of German Lebensraum, living space, near the Atlantic Wall. Atlantic Wall entry prohibited from right in through here. Yep. Vichi France is the common name of the French state, headed by Marshal Philippe Pétain during World War II. Evacuated from Paris to Vichy in the unoccupied free zone, Zone Libre, in the southern part of metropolitan France, which included French Algeria. It remained responsible for the civil administration of France, as well as the French colonial empire. From 1940 to 1942, while the Vichy regime was the nominal government of all of France except for Alsace-Lorraine, the Germans and Italians militarily occupied northern and southeastern France, while Paris remained the de jure capital of France. The government chose to relocate the town of Vichy 360 kilometers, 220 miles to the south in the Zone Libre. The government chose to relocate to the town of Vichy, right, which thus became the de facto capital of the French state. Following the Allied landings in French North Africa in November 1942, southern France was also militarily occupied by Germany and Italy to protect the Mediterranean coastline. Petain's government remained in Vichy as the nominal government of France, albeit one that collaborated with Nazi Germany from November 1942 onwards. The government at Vichy remained there until late 1944. This is the emblem that they used on the French flag. So, on the 27th of October 1940, the Empire Defense Council, Council de Défense de l'Empire, was constituted to organize the rule of the territories in Central Africa, Asia, and Oceania that had heeded the 18th June call, and it was replaced on 24th September 1941 by the French National Committee, the CNF. On the 13th of July 1942, Free France was officially renamed Fighting France, France Combat, to mark that the struggle against the Nazis was conducted both externally by the FFF and internally by the French Forces of the Interior, FFI. After the reconquest of North Africa, this was in turn formally merged with de Gaulle's rival, General Henry Guérand, Giraud's command in Algiers to form the French Committee of National Liberation, um, Comité de France de Libération Nationale, or CFNL. Exile officially ended with the liberation of Paris by the 2nd Armored Free French Division and Resistance Forces on 25th of August 1944. Ushering in the provisional government of the French Republic, GPRF, it ruled France until the end of the war, and afterwards to 1946, when the Fourth Republic was established, thus ending the series of interim regimes that had succeeded the Third Republic after its fall in 1940. The Free French fought Axis and Vichy regime troops and served on battlefronts everywhere, from the Middle East to Indochina and North Africa. The Free French Navy operated as an auxiliary force to the Royal Navy, and in the North Atlantic to the Royal Canadian Navy. Free French units also served in the Royal Air Force, Soviet Air Force, and British SAS troops, Special Air Service, commando units, before larger commands were established directly under the control of the government in exile. So here is Free French territories, and that's the emblem. Here's the French West Africa, Algeria, Libya, and a bunch of different areas. It's certainly extending down in the pink, and in Syria as well, French colonization of Syria, and much of Western Africa, as you can see. The Free French Provisional Government declared the re-establishment of a Provisional French Republic to ensure continuity with the defunct Third Republic. It set about raising new troops to participate in the advance to the Rhine and the Western Allied invasion of Germany by using the French forces of the interior as military cadres and manpower pools of experienced fighters to allow a very large and rapid expansion of the French Liberation Army, Armée Française de la Libération. It was well equipped and well supplied despite the economic disruption brought by the occupation, thanks to Lend-Lease and agreement from the United States, and grew from 500,000 men in the summer of 1944, and of course Lend-Lease also from Canada as well support. Grew from 500,000 men in the summer of 1944 to over 1.3 million by VE Day, making it the fourth largest Allied army in Europe. So, casualties. Here are some partisans. French partisans are famous for continuing to fight through 1944. They lost many lives. By the end of the war, some 580,000 French citizens had died. 40,000 of these by the Western Allied forces during the bombardments of the first 48 hours of Operation Overlord and the take-back of France. Military deaths were 92,000 in 1939-1940. Some 58,000 were killed in action from 1940 to 1945, fighting in Free French forces, and different areas in North Africa and somewhat. Some 40,000 Magalus against our will citizens of the re-annexed Alsace-Lorraine province drafted into the Wehrmacht became casualties. 40,000. Civilian casualties amounted to around 150,000, 60,000 by aerial bombing, 60,000 in the resistance, and 30,000 murdered by German occupation forces. The prisoners of war and deportee totals were around 1.9 million. So much of the French army that was left on, if they didn't escape through Operation at Dunkirk, Dynamo, or Operation Ariel or Cycle, they didn't escape there, then good chances are they have either been killed or they've been taken prisoner. And a vast majority of the French military was taken prisoner in 1940. And the ones who escaped were, of course, the Free Charles de Gaulle, organized as the Free Fighting French. Of these, 240,000 died in captivity. Amazing. An estimated 40,000 were prisoners of war. Um, the, and then 100,000 racial deportees. And so, of these, of the 190 prisoners of war, 240,000 died in captivity, and an estimated 40,000 were prisoners of war. 100,000 racial deportees were killed, and 60,000 political prisoners, and 40,000 died as slave laborers. Wow. So German casualties are hard to determine, but commonly accepted figures are in the total operation from May 10th to June 22nd, 27,074 killed, 111,034 wounded, and 18,384 missing. German dead may have been as high as 45,000 men due to non-combat causes, died of wounds and missing or were later listed as dead. The battle cost the Luftwaffe 28% of its frontline strength. Some 1,236 to 1,428 aircraft were destroyed. 1,129 to enemy action, 299 in accidents. 323 to 488 were damaged. 225 to enemy action. 263 in accidents, making 36% of the Luftwaffe strength lost or damaged. Luftwaffe casualties amounted to 6,653 men, including 4,417 aircrew. Of these, 1,129 were killed and 1,930 were reported missing or captured, many of whom were liberated from French prison camps upon the French capitulation. Italian casualties amounted to 631 or 642 men killed, 2,631 wounded, and 616 reported missing. A further 2,151 men suffered from frostbite during the campaign in the Alps. The official Italian numbers were compiled for a report on the 18th of July 1940, when many of the fallen still lay under snow, and it is probable that most of the Italian missing were dead. Units operating in more difficult terrain at higher ratios of missing to killed, but probably most of the missing had died. According to the French Defense Historical Service, 85,310 French military personnel were killed, including 5,000 Maccabees, Indian colonized troops. 12,000 were reported missing. 120,000 were wounded, and 1,540,000 prisoners of war, including 67,000 Maccabees, were taken. Some recent French research indicates that the number of killed was between 55 and 85,000, which they've explained earlier. A statement of the French Defense Historical Service tending to the lower end. In August 1940, 1,540,000 prisoners were taken into Germany, where roughly 940,000 remained until 1945 in solid Luft camps, when they were liberated by advancing Allied forces. At least 3,000 Senegalese tirailleurs were murdered after being taken prisoner, seen as racially inferior. While in captivity, 24,600 French prisoners died. 71,000 escaped. 220,000 were released by various agreements under the Vichy government. In Germany, several 100,000 were paroled because of disability and or sickness. Air losses are estimated at 1,274 aircraft destroyed during the campaign. French tank losses amount to 1,749 tanks. 43% of the tanks engaged, of which 1,669 were lost to gunfire, 45 to mines, 35 to aircraft. Tank losses are amplified by the large numbers that were abandoned or scuttled and then captured. The British Expeditionary Force suffered 66,426 casualties, 11,014 killed or died of wounds, 14,074 wounded, and 41,338 men missing or taken prisoner. About 64,000 vehicles were destroyed or abandoned, and 2,472 guns were destroyed or abandoned, and that's at Dunkirk. A lot of them. The RAF losses from 10th of May to June 22nd from Fall Gelb to Fall Rot, 22nd of June, amounted to 931 aircraft and 1,526 casualties. The British lost 243 ships to the Luftwaffe bombing in Dynamo, including 8 destroyers and 8 troop ships, which I've mentioned before in Operation Dynamo presentation. Belgian losses were 6,093 killed, 15,850 wounded, and more than 500 missing. Those captured amounted to 200,000 men, whom 2,000 died in captivity. The Belgians also lost 112 aircraft. The Dutch armed forces lost 2,332 killed and 7,000 wounded. Polish losses were around 5,500 killed or wounded and 16,000 prisoners. And this is in this operation which they retreated to after their country being invaded as the first target. Nearly 13,000 troops of the 2nd Infantry Division were interned in Switzerland for the duration of the war. So, these are the German casualties and the total Allied casualties. And these numbers, of course, the total casualties killed, captured, aircraft, and all that for Allied in this whole operation. Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, and Case Red, Fall Rot. So the Allied lost 2,260,000 casualties, and that's French, British, Belgium, and of course Dutch as well. And the Germans lost, and Germans and Italians lost 163,676 casualties. Amazing. 46 days. Hitler had expected 1 million Germans to die in conquering France. Instead, his goal was accomplished in just 6 weeks, with only 27,000 Germans killed, 18,400 missing, and 111,000 wounded. And there's a lot of figures that are going on here, and they're all basically very similar or the same. Little more than a third of the German casualties in the Battle of Verdun during World War I. The unexpected swift victory resulted in a wave of euphoria among the German population and a strong upsurge in war fever. Hitler's popularity reached its peak with the celebration of the French capitulation on July 6, 1940. On the 19th of July, during the 1940 Field Marshal ceremony at the Kroll Opera House in Berlin, Hitler promoted 12 generals to the rank of Field Marshal. Walter von Brauchitsch, commander of the German Army; William Keitel, chief of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, deputy chief of staff; Gerd von Rundstedt, German commander-in-chief of Army Group A; Frieder von Bock, commander of Army Group B; William von Lib, commander-in-chief of Army Group C; Gunther von Klug, commander of the 4th Army; Wilhelm List, commander of the 12th Army; Erwin von Witzleben, commander of the 1st Army; Walter von Richelieu, commander of the 6th Army; Albert Kesselring, commander of Luftflotte 2, Air Fleet 2. Gerhard Milch, Inspector General of the Luftwaffe. Hugo Speer, commander of the Luftflotte 3, Air Fleet 3. This number of promotions to what had previously been the highest rank in the Wehrmacht, Hermann Göring, commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, and already a field marshal, was elevated to the new rank of Reichsmarschall, was unprecedented. In the First World War, Kaiser Wilhelm II had promoted only 5 generals to field marshal. And here is Hermann Göring, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. Okay, thank you very much.